Hey everyone, if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors who think they own your property, this story is for you. Today, I'm sharing how an HOA Karen called 911 because I blocked her from using my private land as her personal shortcut. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to catch more stories like this. Now let's dive in. It was a crisp October morning when I finally decided to take action. The kind of morning where the autumn air feels sharp in your lungs and the rising sun casts long shadows across frost-tipped grass. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the now familiar parade of cars cutting through my property. A steady stream of neighbors using my private driveway as their personal shortcut to avoid the main road's morning traffic. My property in Pine Grove Estate sat at a unique spot, a corner lot where my private driveway created a tempting shortcut between Maple Ridge Drive and the main road. When I purchased the house 6 months ago, the previous owners hadn't mentioned anything about this unofficial community route. The property's extensive acreage and privacy had been its main selling points, and I'd fallen in love with the traditional colonial home nestled among mature oak trees. The real estate agent had emphasized the peaceful nature of the neighborhood, the strong sense of community, and the well-maintained properties. What she hadn't mentioned was how the neighbors had gradually transformed my private driveway into their personal thoroughfare. It wasn't just one or two cars, it was dozens of vehicles each day, treating my property like a public road. I took another sip of my coffee, watching as Barbara Thompson's distinctive white SUV made its usual morning appearance. Barbara, the self-appointed queen of the Pine Grove Community Association, was perhaps the most frequent offender. Every morning at 7:45 a.m. sharp, she'd cruise through my property, coffee tumbler in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, completely ignoring the fact that she was trespassing on private property. The peaceful morning light filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on my kitchen counter. It was almost ironic how serene everything looked while I contemplated the confrontation that was about to unfold. I'd spent weeks planning this moment, consulting with lawyers, reviewing property documents, and gathering security camera footage of the constant stream of trespassers. My solution sat in the garage, two heavy-duty decorative gates that would be installed later that morning. The contractors were due to arrive at 9 a.m., and I'd strategically chosen a Saturday for the installation. I wanted everyone, especially Barbara, to witness the end of their unauthorized shortcut. I glanced at my phone, checking the time. 7:43 a.m. Right on schedule, I heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel. Barbara's white SUV appeared, slowing slightly as she navigated the curve of my driveway. She gave a casual wave to Linda Warren, my only sympathetic neighbor, who was walking her golden retriever along the sidewalk. The scene looked almost picturesque. If you ignored the fact that none of these people had any right to be using my private property as their personal thoroughfare. The contractor's truck pulled up early, breaking my contemplation. Mike, the lead installer, stepped out with a clipboard in hand. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Ready to reclaim your property?" I couldn't help but smile as I walked out to meet him. The plans we'd drawn up were perfect. Beautiful black iron gates that would enhance the property's aesthetics while serving a very practical purpose. As Mike and his team began unloading their equipment, I noticed Barbara's SUV making its return trip, slowing noticeably as she passed the contractor's truck. Her reaction was exactly what I'd expected. The SUV came to a complete stop, and I could see her reaching for her phone. I knew what was coming. She wasn't going to let her convenient shortcut disappear without a fight, but I was prepared. Every document, every property line survey, every legal consultation had led to this moment. The morning sun continued to rise, casting a golden glow over Pine Grove Estates. Soon, the peace of this Saturday morning would be shattered by what I knew was coming. But for now, I stood in my driveway, watching as Mike's team began marking the spots for the gateposts. The weight of the certified letter from my lawyer felt reassuring in my pocket, a reminder that I was completely within my rights to do this. Just then, I heard a car door slam. Barbara was marching across my lawn, phone in hand, her face set in that distinctive expression that had become all too familiar to everyone in Pine Grove Estates. The same expression she wore at every HOA meeting when she found something to complain about. The peaceful beginning of my Saturday was about to erupt into chaos, but I felt oddly calm. Sometimes peace isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about standing your ground when you know you're right. And as Barbara approached, her designer heels sinking slightly into my morning damp lawn, I knew this was going to be a day that Pine Grove Estates would never forget. Living in Pine Grove Estates had been relatively peaceful during my first few months here. Before the shortcut situation spiraled out of control, I'd established a comfortable routine in my new home. The property itself was everything I dreamed. Of 3 acres of well-maintained land with mature trees, a spacious colonial house with a wraparound porch, and enough distance from neighbors to feel private while still being part of a community. My mornings typically started early, watching the sunrise from my porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the birds and enjoying the tranquility. The house sat perfectly positioned on a slight elevation, offering beautiful views of the surrounding landscape. I'd spent countless hours renovating the garage, setting up my home office, and planning future improvements for the property. The previous owners had maintained beautiful gardens, which I was determined to preserve. Every weekend, I'd work in the yard, trimming bushes, pulling weeds, and keeping everything exactly to the HOA's strict landscaping standards. Even Barbara Thompson had initially complimented my dedication to property maintenance during one of her early morning drive-thrus. Pine Grove Estates had seemed like the perfect place to settle down. The community appeared well organized, the properties were beautifully maintained, and most neighbors seemed friendly enough. Linda Warren, who lived 2 houses down, would often stop by during her morning walks with her golden retriever, Max. We'd chat about neighborhood news, and she'd share stories about the community's history. I remember the day Linda first mentioned the shortcut situation. She'd been walking Max when she stopped by my driveway, looking somewhat hesitant. "You know, Alex," she'd said, adjusting Max's leash, "I should probably tell you something about your driveway." She explained how the previous owners had been too passive to address the situation, allowing it to become an unspoken community access point. At first, I hadn't thought much of it. A few cars using my driveway as a shortcut didn't seem like a major issue. The property was large enough that I barely noticed the occasional vehicle passing through. I even found myself waving to neighbors as they drove past, embracing what I thought was just part of community living. Rachel Cooper, who had moved into Pine Grove Estates just a month after me, would sometimes stop her car to chat when she saw me working in the yard. She was new to the area too, and we'd compare notes about adjusting to life under the strict HOA rules. "At least your property is beautiful," she'd say, glancing around at my well-maintained grounds. "Though I don't know how you feel about all this traffic." The traffic she referred to had grown gradually. What started as a few cars had evolved into a steady stream of vehicles, particularly during rush hour. The quiet mornings I'd enjoyed during my first weeks were increasingly interrupted by the sound of cars crunching over my gravel driveway. Still, I tried to maintain a positive attitude, focusing instead on making improvements to my property. Joe Martinez, our regular mailman, had become a friendly face during these early days. He'd often comment on the changes I was making to the house and grounds. "Place is looking better every day, Mr. Mitchell," he'd say during his daily deliveries. But even he had noticed the increasing traffic. "Sure are a lot of cars using your driveway these days," he'd mentioned casually one afternoon, watching as 3 vehicles passed through in quick succession. I spent those first months focusing on making my house a home. I'd installed new security cameras, though initially just for general safety. The footage they captured of the daily parade of vehicles through my property wasn't something I'd paid much attention to at first. I was too busy establishing my routine, setting up my home office, and trying to be a good neighbor. Barbara Thompson had seemed relatively harmless during those early days. She'd stop by occasionally, usually after driving through my property, to remind me about various HOA regulations. "Just wanting to make sure you're aware of our community standards," she'd say, with that practiced smile of hers. I'd thank her, politely, all while watching more cars use my driveway as a thoroughfare. The HOA meetings I attended during those first months were eye-opening.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Richard Parker, the HOA manager, would conduct the sessions with rigid efficiency, while Barbara would dominate the discussions with her concerns about everything from mailbox colors to lawn ornament regulations. I'd sit quietly, observing the dynamics, never imagining how these meetings would later become battlegrounds. My property had quickly become my pride and joy. I'd invested time and money into maintaining its pristine condition, following every HOA guideline to the letter. The massive oak trees that lined my driveway created a natural canopy, making even the unauthorized shortcut look picturesque. Patricia Henderson, another HOA board member, had even featured photos of my landscaping in the community newsletter. Looking back, I realize now that my attention to detail and commitment to property maintenance had probably made the eventual confrontation even more intense. I'd established myself as someone who cared about rules and proper procedures, making it all the more ironic when Barbara would later try to paint me as the problem neighbor. Those comfortable early days had lulled me into a false sense of security. I'd focused on being the perfect neighbor, maintaining the perfect property, following all the perfect rules. Yet all the while, my private driveway was becoming more and more of a public thoroughfare, with neighbors like Barbara Thompson feeling increasingly entitled to use my property as they pleased. The comfort zone I'd established was about to be shattered, but during those initial months I was too focused on settling in to see the storm that was brewing. The security cameras continued recording the steady stream of vehicles. My gravel driveway gradually showed more wear from the constant traffic, and Barbara Thompson's SUV continued its daily appearances, all building toward the inevitable confrontation that would turn Pine Grove Estates upside down. The first real warning signs started appearing about 4 months after I moved in. What had begun as a minor inconvenience was steadily growing into a serious problem. The steady stream of vehicles using my driveway had worn deep ruts into the gravel, and the peaceful mornings I'd once enjoyed were now punctuated by the constant sound of cars cutting through my property. It was during a particularly busy Tuesday morning when I first noticed Barbara Thompson's behavior changing. Her usual quick wave had been replaced by an air of entitlement, as if my driveway was her personal expressway. That morning, she'd even slowed down to take a phone call, essentially parking on my property for several minutes. When I stepped outside to check my mailbox, she'd given me a look that clearly said, "What are you going to do about it?" The security cameras I'd installed were now capturing an average of 50 cars per day, using my driveway as a shortcut. The footage showed a clear pattern: morning rush hour between 7:30 and 9 a.m., afternoon school pickup around 3 p.m., and evening commute between 5 and 7 p.m. My private property had essentially become an unofficial bypass road for the entire neighborhood. Linda Warren, during one of her morning walks with Max, stopped to share some concerning information. "Alex," she'd said, lowering her voice, "I thought you should know. Barbara was talking about your driveway at the last book club meeting." "It is." Apparently, Barbara had been telling everyone how convenient my property's location was for avoiding traffic, even suggesting they should petition the HOA to make it an official community access point. The situation escalated when Steve Thompson, Barbara's husband, started leading entire caravans of cars through my property during their weekly neighborhood watch patrols. They'd drive through slowly, flashlights scanning my property as if they had every right to be there. I'd watch from my window as 6 or 7 cars would follow Steve's lead, their headlights illuminating my private property like some kind of authorized security detail. Joe Martinez, our observant mailman, had more warnings to share. "Mr. Mitchell," he'd said one afternoon, "I've been delivering mail here for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this. Even the previous owners didn't have this many people cutting through." He'd paused before adding, "And Mrs. Thompson's been asking a lot of questions about your mail delivery schedule." The wear and tear on my property was becoming impossible to ignore. The gravel driveway needed constant maintenance, and the grass along the edges was being steadily destroyed by cars that took the turns too widely. When I tried to repair the damage one weekend, Barbara's white SUV had actually stopped, and she'd taken photos with her phone, as if documenting my yard work was somehow necessary. Rachel Cooper brought another warning during one of our casual conversations. "I overheard Barbara at the community center," she'd told me, looking concerned. "She was talking about how your driveway is technically wide enough to be classified as a road according to county regulations. She's been researching municipal codes, Alex." The HOA meetings had taken on a different tone as well. Richard Parker, usually focused on routine community matters, had started making vague references to access points and community circulation patterns. Barbara would sit in the front row, nodding enthusiastically, while shooting meaningful glances in my direction. I'd noticed her huddled with Patricia Henderson after one meeting, pointing at a property map of Pine Grove Estates. The security camera footage became increasingly concerning. Cars I didn't recognize from outside the neighborhood had started using my driveway as a shortcut. Delivery trucks, seeing others use the route, began cutting through as well. One evening, I even spotted a school bus driver using my property to avoid the traffic on the main road. Barbara's behavior grew more bold with each passing day. She'd started parking her SUV at the entrance of my driveway while chatting with other neighbors, creating an impromptu social gathering spot on my property. When I'd walk outside to get my newspaper, the conversations would suddenly stop, replaced by pointed stares and whispered comments. The turning point came when I received an unofficial letter in my mailbox, written on Pine Grove Community Association letterhead, but lacking any official signatures. The letter suggested that homeowners with strategic property positions should consider the greater good of the community when making any changes to their access routes. The implication was clear. They wanted to ensure their shortcut remained available. Linda Warren, always a source of valuable insight, shared more troubling news. "Barbara's been gathering signatures," she warned me one morning. "She's trying to prove that your driveway has been used as a community route for so long that it should be classified as a prescriptive easement." The legal implications of that term sent a chill down my spine. The final warning sign came in the form of a community newsletter article, clearly written by Barbara, though attributed to the HOA board. It discussed the historical access patterns of Pine Grove Estates and the importance of maintaining established community routes. My property wasn't mentioned by name, but every resident knew exactly what and who the article was referring to. Even my home security system had started logging unusual activity. Motion sensors would trigger late at night, revealing Barbara or other neighbors driving through my property well after normal hours. The footage showed them driving slowly, examining my driveway and property lines with flashlights, as if searching for something they could use against me. These escalating warning signs had made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't just about a convenient shortcut anymore. This was about control, about entitlement, about someone believing they had the right to claim my private property for community use without my consent. The security cameras, the property damage, the late-night drive-thrus, the unofficial letters, and Barbara's increasingly bold behavior, all of it pointed to an inevitable confrontation. As I stood in my kitchen that final morning, watching Barbara's SUV make its usual pass through my property, I knew the warning signs had served their purpose. They'd shown me exactly what I was up against and confirmed that my decision to install the gates was not just right. It was necessary. The peaceful existence I'd hoped for in Pine Grove Estates had been gradually eroded by these warning signs, each one pushing me closer to the moment when I'd have to take a stand. Barbara's march across my lawn that Saturday morning marked the beginning of our first real confrontation. Her designer heels sank into the morning dew-covered grass as she approached, phone already raised as if it were a weapon. Behind her, the contractors continued unloading equipment for the gate installation, the metallic sounds of their work providing an oddly appropriate soundtrack for the showdown that was about to unfold. "Alex Mitchell," Barbara's voice carried across my property with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She gestured dramatically at the contractors and their equipment, her free hand clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. I stood my ground at the edge of my driveway, maintaining a calm demeanor that I knew would only irritate her more. "Good morning, Barbara. I'm having security gates installed on my private property." I emphasized the words private property, watching as her expression tightened. "You can't do this," she declared, stopping a few feet away from me. "This is a community access point. We've been using this road for years." Her voice rose with each word, and I noticed Steve Thompson's car pulling up to the edge of my property, drawn by the commotion. "Actually, Barbara, I can. This is my private property, not a community access point." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the property survey documents I'd been carrying. "I have all the necessary documentation right here, including the original property surveys and approved permits for the gate installation." Barbara's face flushed red as she glanced at the papers in my hand, then back at the contractors who were now beginning to mark the gate positions. "This is absolutely unacceptable. Do you have any idea how many people rely on this route? What about emergency vehicles? What about community safety?" Steve had joined us by now, standing slightly behind his wife with his arms crossed. Other neighbors were beginning to gather at the edges of my property, drawn by Barbara's increasingly loud protests. Linda Warren stood at a distance with Max, watching the scene unfold with obvious concern. "Emergency vehicles have never had official access through my property, Barbara," I replied calmly. "The main road is designed and designated for that purpose. As for community safety, I'd argue that having unauthorized traffic cutting through private property is actually a liability issue." Barbara's phone was now pointed directly at me, obviously recording. "This is harassment," she declared, though it wasn't clear who was harassing whom at this point. "You're disrupting established community patterns. The HOA will hear about this." "The HOA has already been notified," I countered, pulling out another document. "I submitted all the required documentation for property modifications last month. The gates meet all HOA guidelines for appearance and safety standards." I'd done my homework thoroughly, and Barbara knew it. Steve stepped forward, attempting to look intimidating. "Listen, Mitchell, you're new here. You don't understand how things work in Pine Grove Estates. We have traditions, established patterns. Traditions don't override property rights." I interrupted firmly. "And established patterns of trespassing don't create legal rights to continue trespassing." This seemed to push Barbara over the edge. She turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered. "Do you all see this?" She called out, gesturing wildly with her phone. "This is exactly what happens when we let outsiders into our community. They have no respect for our way of life." Rachel Cooper, who had joined the spectators, spoke up unexpectedly. "Barbara, it is his property. Maybe we should." "Stay out of this, Rachel," Barbara snapped. "You're still new here too. You don't understand what's at stake." She turned back to me, her voice taking on a threatening tone. "This isn't over, Alex. Not by a long shot." The contractors had paused their work, unsure how to proceed with the growing crowd. Mike, the lead installer, approached me quietly. "Mr. Mitchell, should we continue or—" "Yes, please continue," I said, firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have all the necessary permits and authorizations. This installation is proceeding as planned." Barbara's face contorted with fury. She jabbed her finger toward me, her voice shaking with anger. "You'll regret this, Alex Mitchell. I'm calling the police right now. This is a public safety issue." As she dialed 911, I couldn't help but notice the absurdity of the situation. Here was a grown woman calling the police because someone was preventing her from trespassing on their private property. The gathered neighbors watched in silence as Barbara paced back and forth, dramatically explaining to the dispatcher how I was endangering the community by installing gates on my own property. Steve attempted one more intimidation tactic. "No, Mitchell, things can get very difficult for people who don't cooperate with the community. HOA violations can be found anywhere if people look hard enough." I met his gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Steve? Because I'm recording this conversation too." I gestured to my security cameras, which had been capturing everything from multiple angles. "And I'm sure the HOA board would be very interested in hearing about attempts to intimidate homeowners who are following all proper procedures." The first clash was reaching its crescendo. Barbara was still on the phone with police dispatch, now pacing in circles and becoming increasingly agitated, as the dispatcher apparently wasn't providing the response she wanted. Steve had taken a step back, clearly reconsidering his approach. The gathered neighbors were murmuring among themselves, some looking embarrassed, others curious, and a few seemingly impressed by my stand. Linda Warren had made her way closer, positioning herself somewhat symbolically between me and the Thompsons. "Barbara," she called out, her voice firm but kind. "Maybe we should all calm down and discuss this rationally." But rational discussion was clearly not on Barbara's agenda. She ended her call with a triumphant look. "The police are on their way. We'll see what they have to say about this disruption to community safety." She turned to the gathered crowd again. "Everyone stay. Right here, we need witnesses to this. This assault on our community's way of life." I couldn't help but shake my head at the theatrics. "Barbara, installing security gates on private property is not an assault on anything. It's a basic property right. But by all means, let's wait for the police. I'm sure they'll be very interested in reviewing my security footage of all the unauthorized traffic through my property over the past months." The first clash had set the stage for what was to come, as we all stood there, waiting for the police to arrive. I knew this was just the beginning. Barbara's reaction had confirmed everything I'd suspected about her sense of entitlement, and her threat to involve the HOA made it clear that this would escalate beyond just this morning's confrontation. The contractors had resumed their work, the steady sound of their equipment providing a counterpoint to Barbara's continued protests. The morning sun was higher now, casting our shadows across my driveway. The very piece of property that had somehow become the battlefield for this suburban war. The sound of police sirens cut through the morning air about 15 minutes after Barbara's call. Officer David Wilson's patrol car pulled up to the growing scene, followed closely by his partner, Officer Mark Rodriguez, in a separate vehicle. Barbara immediately rushed toward them, her phone still recording everything. "Officers, thank goodness you're here." She gestured wildly toward me and the contractors. "This man is creating a serious public safety hazard. He's blocking an essential community access route." Officers Wilson and Rodriguez approached the situation with professional caution, taking in the scene. The contractors still working on the gate installation, the crowd of neighbors gathered around, and Barbara's theatrical performance. Officer Wilson, who appeared to be the senior officer, spoke first. "Ma'am, please calm down and explain the situation," he said, pulling out his notepad. "What exactly is the emergency here?" I stood quietly, waiting my turn while Barbara launched into an elaborate explanation about historical community access and established patterns of use. She waved her arms animatedly, pointing to various neighbors for support. Steve Thompson stood behind her, nodding gravely at everything she said. Officer Rodriguez had made his way over to me. "Sir, could you explain your side of the situation?" "Of course, officer," I replied, pulling out my carefully prepared documentation. "I'm the property owner, Alex Mitchell. I'm having security. Gates installed on my private driveway. I have all the necessary permits, HOA approvals, and property surveys right here. Some neighbors have been using my private driveway as a shortcut without permission, and I'm simply securing my property." The officer reviewed my documents carefully, while Barbara continued her passionate speech to Officer Wilson about community traditions and safety concerns. I could see Linda Warren shaking her head in embarrassment, while Rachel Cooper whispered something to another neighbor. "These permits appear to be in order," Officer Rodriguez said, looking through the paperwork. "You've followed all the proper procedures." Barbara overheard this and rushed over, Steve close behind. "But officers, you don't understand. This driveway has been used by the community for years. There's such a thing as established right-of-way." Officer Wilson joined us, his expression professional but slightly weary. "Mrs. Thompson, is that correct? Has this driveway been officially designated as a public right-of-way?" "Well, no, but..." Barbara stammered, her confidence faltering slightly. "But we've been using it for years. That creates a right." "Actually, it doesn't," I interjected calmly, pulling out another document. "I've had my lawyer research this. Specifically, no easement has ever been recorded for this property, and unauthorized use doesn't create legal rights. I have the documentation right here." The officers exchanged glances, and Officer Wilson turned to Barbara. "Ma'am, if this is private property and the owner has all the proper permits for the gate installation, there's no law being broken here. This isn't a police matter." But what about emergency vehicle access?" Barbara protested, grasping at straws. "This could be a matter of life and death." Officer Rodriguez shook his head. "Ma'am, emergency vehicles use designated public roads. We don't rely on private driveways for emergency access routes." The crowd of neighbors had grown quieter, sensing that this confrontation wasn't going Barbara's way. Steve Thompson stepped in forward, attempting to add weight to his wife's arguments. "Officers, surely there's something in the municipal code about blocking established community routes," he suggested, trying to sound authoritative. Officer Wilson's patience was visibly wearing thin. "Sir, unless you can provide documentation of a legal easement or public right-of-way, this is private property. The owner has the right to secure it as he sees fit, as long as he follows proper procedures, which he clearly has." Barbara's face had turned an even deeper shade of red. "This is outrageous. I want to speak to your supervisor. I'm going to file a complaint." "You have that right, ma'am," Officer Wilson replied calmly. "But right now, you're all going to need to disperse unless you have legitimate business here. This is private property, and the owner has the right to proceed with his permitted construction." The officer's clear support of my position sent a ripple through the crowd. Some neighbors began to drift away, while others lingered to watch Barbara's reaction. She stood there, sputtering with indignation, her phone still recording everything. "This isn't over," she declared, pointing at me. "The HOA will hear about this. We'll see what Richard Parker has to say about this disruption to our community." Officer Rodriguez turned to me. "Sir, do you want us to stay while the contractors continue their work?" I nodded gratefully. "If you could, just until the initial installation is complete. I'm concerned about potential interference with the contractors." Barbara gasped dramatically at this. "Are you suggesting I would interfere with your precious gate installation? I would never." "Ma'am," Officer Wilson said firmly, "I suggest you return to your home now. You've been informed that this is a permitted construction project on private property. Any interference could result in legal consequences." The officer's presence had changed the dynamic completely. The contractors returned to their work with renewed focus, while Barbara and Steve stood at the edge of my property, engaged in intense, whispered conversation. Other neighbors gradually dispersed, though I noticed several of them taking photos and videos with their phones, undoubtedly for sharing on the neighborhood's social media groups. Linda Warren approached me quietly. "Alex, you know this isn't really about the driveway anymore, right? Barbara's not going to let this go." I nodded, watching as the first gate post was being set into position. "I know, Linda, but I can't let her bully me into giving up my property rights. This has gone on long enough." The morning sun was now high in the sky, and the gates were starting to take shape. Officer Wilson and Rodriguez maintained their presence, occasionally walking the perimeter of my property to ensure there was no interference with the construction. Barbara and Steve had retreated to their front yard, but continued to watch and record everything from a distance. This was just the first wave of the storm, and I knew it. Barbara's threat to involve Richard Parker and the HOA wasn't idle. She would absolutely escalate this to the next level. But watching the gates being installed, seeing my property finally being secured, I felt a sense of rightness, despite the drama unfolding around me. The rising action of this conflict had brought the police into it, just as Barbara had wanted, though certainly not with the outcome she'd hoped for. As I stood there, watching the officers maintain order while my gates were installed, I couldn't help but wonder what the next phase of this suburban warfare would bring. The week following the gate installation brought an unexpected and unsettling calm to Pine Grove Estates. The gates stood proudly at my driveway entrance, their black iron frames a statement of both elegance and purpose. The contractors had done an excellent job, matching the gate's design perfectly with the neighborhood's aesthetic while ensuring they were sturdy enough to serve their intended purpose. To my surprise, Barbara Thompson had seemingly retreated from the battlefield. Her white SUV no longer appeared during its usual times, forced to use the main road like everyone else. The steady stream of cars cutting through my property had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence that felt almost too good to be true. On Monday morning, I stood at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise without the usual parade of trespassing vehicles. The absence of traffic made my property feel like mine again, and I allowed myself to enjoy a moment of victory. Linda Warren walked by with Max, giving me a friendly wave that I returned with a sense of optimism. "The gates look beautiful, Alex," she called out as I stepped onto my porch. "They really add something to the property." But there was something in her tone, a hint of concern that made me pause. "Thanks, Linda," I replied, walking down to chat. Things seemed to have calmed down a bit. She glanced around before lowering her voice. "Don't let your guard down just yet. Barbara's been making a lot of phone calls, and I've seen her having meetings at her house with some HOA board members." The warning was clear. But I chose to enjoy the peace while it lasted. The next few days passed quietly. The morning rush. Our traffic on the main road had increased noticeably, now that drivers couldn't cut through my property, but that wasn't my problem to solve. I focused on catching up with work and enjoying my newly private property. Rachel Cooper stopped by on Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to admire the gates. "They really do look fantastic," she said, running her hand along the metalwork. "But..." She hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "But what?" I prompted. "There's been talk at the community center. Barbara's been gathering support, claiming this is just the first step in what she calls the privatization of community spaces. She's turning this into some kind of crusade." I thanked Rachel for the warning, but tried not to let it disturb my newfound peace. The gates were legal, properly permitted, and served a legitimate purpose. What more could Barbara really do? Thursday brought Joe Martinez with the mail and more insights into the situation. "Lot of certified letters going around the neighborhood, Mr. Mitchell," he mentioned casually. "Been delivering them all week, mostly from the HOA office." I nodded, understanding the implication. Barbara was rallying her troops, preparing for something. But for now, the peace held, and I decided to enjoy it while I could. That evening, I sat on my porch, enjoying the sunset without the usual parade of cars cutting through my property. The gates caught the golden light beautifully, casting intricate shadows across the driveway. The peace felt tangible, but there was something else in the air. An anticipation, like the stillness before a storm. Steve Thompson drove by slowly on the main road, clearly taking photos of my property with his phone. He didn't wave or acknowledge me, just documented whatever. He thought he needed to document and moved on. It was behavior that should have worried me more than it did, but I was too caught up in the temporary tranquility of my victory. Friday brought more signs that the peace was merely an illusion. Patricia Henderson, the HOA board member, walked past my property 3 times, each time making notes on a clipboard. She avoided making eye contact when I waved, her body language suggesting she was there on official business rather than taking a casual stroll. The weekend arrived with perfect weather and an almost suspicious lack of drama. No cars attempted to enter my gated driveway. No neighbors complained about their extended commute times, and even Barbara seemed to have disappeared entirely from view. Her white SUV remained parked in her driveway, unused. Linda Warren, ever the vigilant neighbor, brought more news during her Saturday morning walk. "They're planning something, Alex," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Barbara hosted a meeting last night, called it a community action planning session. Half the neighborhood was there. I thanked her for the information, but tried not to let it disturb my weekend. The gates were doing their job, my property was secure, and I had followed every rule and regulation to the letter. What could they really do? Sunday morning, I noticed a few neighbors gathered at Barbara's house again, their cars parked along the street. They spoke in hushed tones and dispersed quickly when they saw me watching. It should have worried me more than it did, but the peace of the past week had lulled me into a false sense of security. Richard Parker, the HOA manager, drove past my house slowly that afternoon, his car crawling to a near stop as he examined the gates. He made no attempt to hide his scrutiny, even pulling out his phone to take photos. Still, I tried to convince myself that this was just routine HOA documentation. The false peace continued into the early evening. I worked in my garden, enjoying the solitude that the gates had brought to my property. The setting sun cast long shadows through the iron bars, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the drama was truly over. As darkness fell, I noticed more cars arriving at Barbara's house. The lights in her home blazed bright, and through the windows I could see figures moving about, gesturing animatedly. It looked like another meeting was in progress, but I tried to dismiss it as unimportant. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of Barbara standing at her window, staring in the direction of my property. Even in the darkness, I could see her silhouette, phone pressed to her ear, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. The peace had lasted exactly 1 week. Looking back, I should have known it was too good to be true. The quiet wasn't a sign of acceptance, but rather of preparation. Barbara and her allies weren't admitting defeat. They were regrouping, planning, gathering their forces for what would come next. But for that 1 week, I had enjoyed my victory. The gate stood proud and functional. My property was finally truly private, and the constant stream of trespassing vehicles had ceased. It was a false peace, yes, but sometimes even false peace can be sweet. Monday morning would bring the end of this deceptive calm. But for now, I chose to enjoy these final moments of tranquility. After all, storms are always preceded by an eerie stillness, and in Pine Grove Estates, a storm was definitely brewing. Monday morning arrived with a bang, literally. I was awakened at 6:30 a.m. by the sound of heavy machinery approaching my property. As I rushed to my window, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A large construction crew had set up at the entrance to my driveway, complete with excavation equipment and work trucks. Barbara Thompson stood among them, directing operations like a field general. I threw on clothes and rushed outside, my heart pounding. The workers were gathered around my gates, examining the ground and marking areas with spray paint. Barbara stood confidently beside a man in a hard hat who appeared to be the crew supervisor. "What exactly is going on here?" I demanded, approaching. The group, Barbara's face lit up with that familiar smug smile. "Oh, good morning, Alex. We're just conducting some essential community infrastructure work. The HOA has declared this an emergency maintenance situation." The crew supervisor stepped forward, extending his hand. "Morning, sir. I'm Jim from CityWorks Construction. We're here to assess the water main access point that runs under your driveway." "Water main?" I repeated, confused. "There's no water main under my driveway." "Actually," Barbara interjected, pulling out a stack of papers, "according to these recently discovered utility maps, there is. And as a designated utility access point, your gates are creating a serious safety hazard by blocking emergency access." I felt my blood pressure rising. Those gates were properly permitted. All utility surveys were done before installation. There is no water main here. "Well, we'll just have to dig to make sure, won't we?" Barbara replied sweetly. "The HOA has authorized an emergency inspection. Richard Parker signed off on it himself." Right on cue, Richard Parker's car pulled up to the scene. The HOA manager stepped out, looking officiously concerned. "Mr. Mitchell, I have the emergency authorization paperwork right here. We received an anonymous tip about potential utility access issues." "Anonymous tip?" I scoffed. "Let me guess who that was." I glared at Barbara, who maintained her innocent expression. The situation was escalating quickly. More neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion and heavy machinery. Steve Thompson was already recording everything on his phone, while Patricia Henderson took notes on her ever-present clipboard. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer's emergency number. "Nobody is digging anything until my lawyer reviews these supposed utility maps," I announced firmly. Barbara's smile widened. "Oh, Alex, this is a designated emergency inspection. We don't need property owner permission when public utilities are potentially at risk. Isn't that right, Richard?" Richard Parker nodded gravely. "According to HOA bylaws, Section 7, Paragraph 3, emergency utility inspections take precedence over private property restrictions." The construction crew was already setting up equipment, placing orange cones around my driveway entrance. The gates that had stood for barely a week were about to become the centerpiece of yet another battle. My lawyer answered on the third ring, and I quickly explained the situation. She promised to send an immediate cease and desist order and contact the City Utilities Department, but warned it might take a few hours to stop the work officially. Meanwhile, Barbara had positioned herself strategically between me and the construction crew, continuing to direct operations with obvious pleasure. "The gates will need to be removed, of course," she announced loudly, "for proper access to the utility lines." "Those gates aren't going anywhere," I stated firmly. "This is harassment, and you know it." Linda Warren had arrived on the scene, her morning walk with Max interrupted by the chaos. She approached me quietly. "Alex, I overheard Barbara at the community center yesterday. She's been planning this for days. She somehow got hold of old utility maps from the city archives." The construction supervisor looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Look, sir," he said to me, "we're just here to do a job. If there's going to be a legal dispute—" "There absolutely is going to be a legal dispute," I assured him. "And anyone who damages my property will be named in the lawsuit." Barbara's confident demeanor faltered slightly, but she rallied quickly. "Richard, please explain to Alex how non-compliance with emergency HOA inspections can result in significant fines." Richard Parker cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell, I must inform you that obstructing an emergency utility inspection can result in fines of up to $1,000 per day, as per our bylaws." I stood my ground. "And filing false emergency inspections based on fraudulent utility claims can result in much bigger legal consequences, as my lawyer will be happy to explain." The standoff continued as the morning sun rose higher. The construction crew milled about uncertainly, while Barbara and Richard huddled together, discussing something in hushed tones. More neighbors had gathered to watch the drama unfold, some taking sides, others simply there for the entertainment. Rachel Cooper approached the construction supervisor, introducing herself as a civil engineer. "May I see those utility maps?" she asked professionally. The supervisor handed them over, and Rachel began examining them carefully. After a few minutes, she looked up. "These maps are at least 30 years old," she announced, "and they're marked as preliminary planning documents. They were never approved or implemented." Barbara's face reddened. "That doesn't matter. They still show the potential location of utility lines that need to be inspected." "Actually, it matters a lot," Rachel continued. "I work for the city planning department. These maps were part of a proposed development plan that was rejected. In the 1990s, the water main was never installed here." The construction supervisor removed his hard hat, wiping his brow. "Ma'am," he said to Barbara, "if these aren't current approved utility maps, we can't proceed with any excavation. That would void our insurance coverage." Barbara's carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling, but she wasn't giving up. "Richard, we need to contact the City Utility Board immediately. This is clearly a case of lost documentation. The water main must be here somewhere." My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. "City Utilities confirmed no water main at your location. Cease and desist order being delivered to HOA office now. Hold your ground." The construction crew began packing up their equipment, much to Barbara's visible distress. She alternated between trying to convince them to stay and making threatening phone calls to various authorities. Richard Parker, sensing the shift in momentum, began to back away from the situation. "Perhaps we should postpone this inspection pending further documentation," he suggested carefully. "This isn't over," Barbara declared, pointing at me dramatically. "If there's a water main under your property, we'll find it, and those gates will come down." As the construction trucks pulled away and the crowd of neighbors began to disperse, I couldn't help but marvel at the lengths Barbara had gone to in her attempt to force my gates open. She had actually dug up ancient, rejected utility plans and tried to use them to justify destroying my property improvements. Linda Warren stayed behind after others had left. "You know what this really means, don't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She's getting desperate, but she's also getting more creative with her attacks. The major challenge had been met and overcome, but it had revealed just how far Barbara was willing to go. She had moved beyond simple complaints and police calls to elaborate schemes involving construction crews and falsified utility claims. As I watched her retreat to her house, phone still pressed to her ear, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just another escalation in what was becoming an increasingly complex battle over my right to secure my own property. The failed utility inspection debacle sent shockwaves through Pine Grove Estates. By Tuesday morning, the neighborhood had clearly divided into factions. As I collected my mail, I could feel the weight of stares from various windows, some sympathetic, others hostile. The peaceful suburban community had transformed into a battleground of whispered allegations and chosen sides. Rachel Cooper was the first to experience backlash for her role in exposing the outdated utility maps. She called me that evening, clearly distressed. Alex, Barbara's husband Steve, just submitted a formal complaint about my front garden to the HOA. He's claiming my roses exceed the height restrictions. I've had these roses for months, and they've never been an issue before. The retaliation wasn't subtle. Anyone who had shown support for my position was suddenly finding themselves under intense HOA scrutiny. Linda Warren discovered a violation notice in her mailbox regarding the color of her mailbox post, the same color it had been for the past 5 years. Joe Martinez, our mailman, brought more concerning news during his rounds. "Mr. Mitchell, there's been talk about starting a petition to remove Richard Parker as HOA manager. Barbara's telling everyone he's too lenient with rule enforcement. She's gathering signatures to install Patricia Henderson instead." The community center, once a neutral gathering space, had become ground zero for neighborhood politics. Barbara had effectively taken it over, hosting daily community concern meetings that were thinly veiled strategy sessions for her campaign against my gates. Even local businesses were feeling the pressure. The landscaping company that maintained several properties in Pine Grove Estates, including mine, received an anonymous letter suggesting they might lose clients if they continued servicing non-cooperative homeowners. My longtime landscaper, Mike Davidson, showed me the letter with an apologetic look. "I can't afford to lose half my client base, Alex," he explained uncomfortably. "But this isn't right. They're basically trying to blacklist you." The neighborhood's social fabric was unraveling. The monthly book club, which had been meeting for years, suspended its gatherings after a heated argument about property rights turned a discussion of pride and prejudice into a proxy war about my gates. Children weren't immune to the tension either. I overheard 2 kids riding their bikes past my house, one saying to the other, "Mom says we can't play with the Cooper kids anymore because their mom is on the wrong side." The neighborhood social media group became a battlefield of passive-aggressive posts and veiled accusations. What had once been a place for sharing gardening tips and lost pet notices had transformed into a forum for debating community access rights and traditional neighborhood values. Barbara's influence seemed to grow with each passing day. Those who had initially stayed neutral were being forced to choose sides. The pressure to conform to her vision of the neighborhood was intense, and many found it easier to simply fall in line rather than risk becoming her next target. One evening, I received an unexpected visit from Tom Franklin, who lived 3 doors down. He shuffled uncomfortably on my porch, looking over his shoulder before speaking. "Alex, I want you to know I think you're in the right here. But my wife's on the school board with Barbara, and we can't afford to make waves. I hope you understand. The ripple effect reached beyond our immediate neighborhood. Friends from other parts of town mentioned hearing stories about the gate controversy at Pine Grove Estates. Local real estate agents were quietly warning potential buyers about the community discord in our once peaceful subdivision. The Wednesday Farmers Market, which had been a neighborhood tradition for years, became another casualty. The usual. Vendors found themselves caught in the crossfire, pressured to choose between setting up near Barbara's preferred location or maintaining their regular spots near my end of the street. Patricia Henderson, clearly positioning herself for the HOA manager role, began conducting unofficial property audits throughout the neighborhood. Those who had shown support for my position found themselves subject to particularly rigorous inspections. Even the annual neighborhood garden tour was affected. Gardens that had been featured stops for years were suddenly deemed not up to standard if their owners had expressed support for my right to secure my property. The tour route was redrawn to explicitly avoid certain houses, creating obvious gaps in what had once been a comprehensive community event. The Neighborhood Watch program, which Steve Thompson coordinated, underwent a suspicious reorganization. Supporters of my position found their patrol shifts rescheduled to inconvenient times or eliminated entirely. The message was clear. Conformity was expected and dissent had consequences. Local service providers weren't spared either. The window washing company I'd used for years suddenly became fully booked when I tried to schedule my regular cleaning. The owner later confided that he'd been warned about maintaining business relationships with difficult residents. The community newsletter, once a bland compilation of local events and gardening tips, transformed into a propaganda tool. Barbara, who had somehow acquired an editorial position, began including articles about community cohesion and the importance of maintaining traditional access patterns. Even the annual Halloween preparations were affected. Houses known to support my position were conspicuously left off the recommended trick-or-treat route map that Barbara's committee distributed. The petty exclusion would have been almost amusing if it hadn't so clearly demonstrated how deeply the division had penetrated every aspect of neighborhood life. The ripple effect reached its peak when the neighborhood's annual charity fundraiser approached. The event, which had always united the community in support of local causes, became another battlefield. Barbara's faction insisted on changing venues when they learned the originally scheduled host had expressed support for my position. Rachel Cooper summed it up perfectly during one of our conversations. It's not about the gates anymore, Alex. This has become about power, control, and who gets to define what this community is. The transformation of Pine Grove Estates was both fascinating and disturbing to watch. What had started as a simple property dispute had exposed underlying tensions and power dynamics that had probably existed all along, just waiting for a catalyst to bring them to the surface. Linda Warren, ever the voice of reason, tried to maintain perspective. Communities go through these phases, she said during one of her morning walks. But the scary part is how quickly people are willing to turn on their neighbors over something that doesn't really affect them. As I stood at my kitchen window that evening, watching the sun set behind my controversial gates, I couldn't help but feel responsible for the chaos that had engulfed our once peaceful neighborhood. But then I reminded myself that I had simply exercised my legal property rights. The ripple effect wasn't caused by my actions, but by those who couldn't accept that they weren't entitled to control every aspect of their neighbors' lives. The community would never be quite the same. The ripple effect had exposed too many underlying fissures, revealed too many true colors. But as unsettling as it was to watch this transformation, I knew there was no going back. The only way forward was through the storm, even as the waves continued to spread outward, touching every corner of our once unified community. The official HOA intervention arrived on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the gates were installed. A certified letter landed in my mailbox, bearing the formal Pine Grove Community Association letterhead. The envelope felt heavy, with implied authority. Inside was a notice for a special hearing of the HOA board, scheduled for the following Monday evening. The language was carefully formal, but the intent was clear: to address ongoing community concerns regarding recent property modifications and access patterns at 1542 Maple Ridge Drive. I noticed Richard Parker's signature looked shaky, almost reluctant at the bottom of the page. Below it, in much firmer strokes, was Barbara Thompson's signature as Community Standards Committee Chair, a position I hadn't even known existed until that moment. Linda Warren called within the hour. "Did you get the notice?" she asked, her voice tense. "They're trying to stack the deck, Alex. Barbara's convinced 3 of the 5 board members to side with her already." I spread the notice on my kitchen counter, studying it more carefully. The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community center, and attendance was strongly encouraged for all concerned residents. In other words, Barbara was planning to pack the room with her supporters. My lawyer reviewed the notice and called me back quickly. "They're overreaching," she said confidently, "but we need to be prepared. They'll try to overwhelm you with procedural arguments and community pressure. We should gather all documentation of harassment and attempted interference with your property rights." The days leading up to the hearing were tense. Barbara seemed to be everywhere, holding whispered conversations with neighbors, making phone calls from her front porch, and driving past my house repeatedly. Her white SUV had become a symbol of surveillance, appearing at all hours like a patrol car monitoring a suspect. Rachel Cooper stopped by on Saturday looking worried. "They're planning something big, Alex. Patricia Henderson has been going door to door with some kind of petition. They won't let anyone read the whole thing before signing, just saying it's about preserving community values." Sunday brought more preparations. Steve Thompson was seen delivering thick envelopes to various board members' houses. The community center was mysteriously closed for maintenance, though several cars, including Barbara's, were parked outside for hours. Monday evening arrived with an atmosphere of impending confrontation. I walked into the community center at 6:45 p.m. to find the room already packed. Barbara had orchestrated the seating perfectly. Her supporters filled the front rows, while those sympathetic to my position were relegated to the back or forced to stand. The board members sat at a long table at the front, their faces carefully neutral. Richard Parker occupied the center seat, flanked by Patricia Henderson and 3 other members. Barbara sat at a smaller table to the side, a stack of papers and folders arranged precisely in front of her. At exactly 7 p.m., Richard Parker called the meeting to order. The room fell silent, except for the soft whir of the ceiling fans and the occasional click of Patricia Henderson's pen against her ever-present clipboard. "We're here tonight," Richard began, his voice slightly unsteady, "to address concerns regarding recent modifications to community access patterns at 1542 Maple Ridge Drive. Mrs. Thompson, as Community Standards Committee Chair, will present the initial findings." Barbara rose smoothly, adjusting her blazer. "Thank you, Richard. As many of you know, our community has recently faced unprecedented challenges to our traditional way of life. The installation of gates blocking a long-established community access point has created significant hardship for many residents. She proceeded to present a carefully crafted narrative about historical use patterns and community expectations. Her presentation included photographs, maps, and even graphs showing increased traffic on the main road since my gates were installed. Furthermore, she continued, producing more documents, we have gathered signatures from 78% of resident households expressing concern about this disruption to community access patterns. My lawyer, who sat beside me taking detailed notes, whispered, "Notice she's not calling it a petition. They know they can't legally force you to remove the gates, so they're trying to use community pressure." After Barbara's presentation, Richard Parker called for community input. As expected, a parade of her supporters approached the microphone, each with carefully prepared statements about how the gates had damaged community spirit and created unnecessary hardship. When it was finally my turn to speak, I approached the microphone with my own documentation in hand. I'd like to start by reminding everyone that my property is exactly that, private property. I have followed every legal procedure and HOA guideline in installing these gates. I presented my permits, property surveys, and documentation of the harassment I'd faced. I've had neighbors trespassing on my property, calling the police with false claims, and even attempting unauthorized construction work based on outdated utility maps. The room erupted in murmurs, but I continued. I have security camera footage of every incident, including attempts to interfere with the legal installation of my gates. I also have documentation of the retribution faced by neighbors who supported my right to secure my private property. Barbara attempted to interrupt, but Richard Parker, perhaps finding some backbone, insisted I be allowed to finish. I presented evidence of the targeted HOA violations against my supporters, the attempted service provider boycott, and the social pressure applied to those who defended my property rights. This isn't about community access, I concluded. This is about whether homeowners in Pine Grove Estates have the right to secure their private property when every legal requirement has been met. The board members shifted uncomfortably as my lawyer stood to address legal implications. She methodically outlined the potential liability issues for the HOA if they attempted to force removal of properly permitted property improvements, especially given the documented harassment. Richard Parker called a brief recess, during which the board members huddled in intense discussion. Barbara paced near her table, making rapid phone calls and shooting angry glances in my direction. When the meeting resumed, Richard Parker looked even more uncomfortable. After reviewing all presented evidence, the board has determined that the gate installation at 1542 Maple Ridge Drive does not violate any HOA guidelines or regulations. While we understand community concerns about changed access patterns, we cannot mandate the removal of properly permitted property improvements. Barbara's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is unacceptable," she declared, standing. Abruptly, "The community has spoken. We demand action." "Mrs. Thompson," my lawyer interjected calmly, "the community cannot demand the right to trespass on private property, regardless of historical patterns of unauthorized use." The official intervention had reached its climax, but somehow it felt like just another battle in an ongoing war. As the meeting broke up, with Barbara huddled with her supporters and Richard Parker looking relieved to escape, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had officially acknowledged my right to maintain the gates, but Barbara's expression made it clear she wasn't accepting defeat. The official channels had spoken, but in Pine Grove Estates, official rulings seemed to carry less weight than the unwritten rules of power and influence that Barbara wielded so effectively. The aftermath of the HOA hearing brought a strange mix of vindication and anxiety. While I had won the official battle, Barbara's barely contained fury at the meeting made it clear that she was far from surrendering. I knew I needed to prepare for whatever she might try next. My first step was to upgrade my security system. The basic cameras that had documented the previous incidents were replaced with high-resolution models featuring night vision and motion detection. I installed additional cameras to cover every possible angle of my property, ensuring there would be no blind spots that could be exploited. "You're not being paranoid," my lawyer assured me during a strategy session. "Document everything, every incident, every interaction, every apparent retaliation. We need to build a clear pattern of behavior if this escalates further." Linda Warren proved to be an invaluable ally in my preparation efforts. Her morning walks with Max had become an early warning system of sorts. "Barbara's been meeting with someone in a suit," she reported one morning. "They've been parked in front of her house for the past 2 days, looking at documents. I hired a professional security consultant to assess my property's vulnerabilities. He walked the perimeter with me, pointing out potential weak points and suggesting additional measures. These gates are well installed," he noted, "but you might want to add infrared sensors and reinforced locks." Rachel Cooper, using her connections at the city planning department, helped me obtain copies of every relevant property document, survey, and permit dating back to the neighborhood's original development. "If they try another utility access angle," she said, "we'll have every historical record to prove them wrong." I started keeping a detailed log of every vehicle that slowed down or stopped near my property. Barbara's white SUV made frequent appearances, often accompanied by other cars I didn't recognize. Steve Thompson had taken to walking past my house several times a day, always with his phone out, apparently documenting something. The security consultant suggested installing floodlights around the property. "Motion-activated lights can be a strong deterrent," he explained. "Plus, they'll improve your camera footage quality at night." The lights were installed strategically, ensuring any nighttime activities around my gates would be clearly illuminated. I began backing up all my security footage to a secure cloud server. "Don't rely on local storage," my lawyer advised. "If anything happens to your home system, we need to ensure the evidence is preserved." Each day's footage was catalogued and time-stamped, creating an undeniable record of any suspicious activity. Joe Martinez, our observant mailman, continued, providing valuable intelligence. "There's been a lot of certified mail going between Barbara's house and some law office in the city," he mentioned during one delivery. "And she's been getting thick envelopes from some place called Community Rights Advocacy Group." I decided to install a dash cam in my car after noticing I was being followed on my daily commute. Sometimes it was Barbara's SUV, other times unfamiliar vehicles that would tail me for several blocks before turning off. The dash cam would ensure any road-related incidents would be documented. The preparation phase wasn't just about physical security. I began attending every HOA meeting, no matter how minor the agenda. Barbara was clearly trying to build influence within the organization, and I needed to stay informed of any procedural changes she might try to implement. My lawyer helped me draft cease and desist letters, having them ready to send at a moment's notice. "We need to be prepared to respond quickly to any new harassment attempts," she explained. "The faster we act, the clearer it becomes that we won't tolerate interference with your property rights." I created an emergency contact list of supportive neighbors who could serve as witnesses if needed. Linda Warren, Rachel Cooper, and a few others had agreed to document any suspicious activity they observed. We set up a group text chain to share real-time updates about neighborhood developments. The security consultant suggested installing a backup power system for the gates and cameras. The official intervention had reached its climax, but somehow it felt like just another battle in an ongoing war. As the meeting broke up, with Barbara huddled with her supporters and Richard Parker looking relieved to escape, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had officially acknowledged my right to maintain the gates, but Barbara's expression made it clear she wasn't accepting defeat. The official channels had spoken, but in Pine Grove Estates, Official rulings seemed to carry less weight than the unwritten rules of power and influence that Barbara wielded so effectively. The aftermath of the HOA hearing brought a strange mix of vindication and anxiety. While I had won the official battle, Barbara's barely contained fury at the meeting made it clear that she was far from surrendering. I knew I needed to prepare for whatever she might try next. My first step was to upgrade my security system. The basic cameras that had documented the previous incidents were replaced with high-resolution models featuring night vision and motion detection. I installed additional cameras to cover every possible angle of my property, ensuring there would be no blind spots that could be exploited. "You're not being paranoid," my lawyer assured me during a strategy session. "Document everything, every incident, every interaction, every apparent retaliation. We need to build a clear pattern of behavior if this escalates further." Linda Warren proved to be an invaluable ally in my preparation efforts. Her morning walks with Max had become an early warning system of sorts. "Barbara's been meeting with someone in a suit," she reported one morning. "They've been parked in front of her house for the past 2 days, looking at documents. I hired a professional security consultant to assess my property's vulnerabilities. He walked the perimeter with me, pointing out potential weak points and suggesting additional measures. These gates are well installed," he noted, "but you might want to add infrared sensors and reinforced locks." Rachel Cooper, using her connections at the city planning department, helped me obtain copies of every relevant property document, survey, and permit dating back to the neighborhood's original development. "If they try another utility access angle," she said, "we'll have every historical record to prove them wrong." I started keeping a detailed log of every vehicle that slowed down or stopped near my property. Barbara's white SUV made frequent appearances, often accompanied by other cars I didn't recognize. Steve Thompson had taken to walking past my house several times a day, always with his phone out, apparently documenting something. The security consultant suggested installing floodlights around the property. "Motion-activated lights can be a strong deterrent," he explained. "Plus, they'll improve your camera footage quality at night." The lights were installed strategically, ensuring any nighttime activities around my gates would be clearly illuminated. I began backing up all my security footage to a secure cloud server. "Don't rely on local storage," my lawyer advised. "If anything happens to your home system, we need to ensure the evidence is preserved." Each day's footage was catalogued and time-stamped, creating an undeniable record of any suspicious activity. Joe Martinez, our observant mailman, continued, providing valuable intelligence. "There's been a lot of certified mail going between Barbara's house and some law office in the city," he mentioned during one delivery. "And she's been getting thick envelopes from some place called Community Rights Advocacy Group." I decided to install a dash cam in my car after noticing I was being followed on my daily commute. Sometimes it was Barbara's SUV, other times unfamiliar vehicles that would tail me for several blocks before turning off. The dash cam would ensure any road-related incidents would be documented. The preparation phase wasn't just about physical security. I began attending every HOA meeting, no matter how minor the agenda. Barbara was clearly trying to build influence within the organization, and I needed to stay informed of any procedural changes she might try to implement. My lawyer helped me draft cease and desist letters, having them ready to send at a moment's notice. "We need to be prepared to respond quickly to any new harassment attempts," she explained. "The faster we act, the clearer it becomes that we won't tolerate interference with your property rights." I created an emergency contact list of supportive neighbors who could serve as witnesses if needed. Linda Warren, Rachel Cooper, and a few others had agreed to document any suspicious activity they observed. We set up a group text chain to share real-time updates about neighborhood developments. The security consultant suggested installing a backup power system for the gates and cameras. Don't leave yourself vulnerable to any accidental power outages, he advised. The system was designed to kick in automatically if the main power was cut, ensuring continuous operation of all security measures. I began photographing my property daily, creating a visual record of its condition. If anyone attempted to damage the gates or landscape, I would have before and after documentation. The photos were time-stamped and stored both locally and in the cloud. Rachel Cooper helped me create detailed maps of my property lines, marking them with small, unobtrusive surveyor's stakes. If they try to claim any part of your property is community access, she said, we'll have clear physical markers showing the boundaries. I installed sensor-activated sprinklers around the perimeter of my property. While their primary purpose was lawn maintenance, they could also serve as a deterrent to anyone trying to conduct close-up inspections of my gates or property lines. The preparation felt somewhat exhausting but necessary. Barbara's influence in the neighborhood hadn't diminished despite the HOA ruling. If anything, her determination seemed to have intensified. The official channels had failed her, which meant she might resort to more desperate measures. Linda Warren summed it up perfectly during one of her morning visits. You're not just protecting your property anymore, Alex. You're standing up for everyone's right to feel secure in their own homes. That's worth preparing for. I created a detailed schedule of neighborhood activities, noting patterns and unusual gatherings. Barbara's community meetings had become more frequent but less public, often held in private homes with invited attendees only. Understanding these patterns could help predict their next move. The security consultant's final recommendation was to install a backup cellular internet connection. Don't rely solely on your home network for security communications, he advised. A redundant system ensures you'll maintain surveillance even if your primary internet is disrupted. As the preparations came together, I couldn't help but feel both more secure and more anxious. Every new security measure, every documented incident, every precaution taken reminded me that this conflict was far from over. Barbara's determination to regain control of my property had only grown stronger since the HOA ruling. But I was ready. My property was secured, my rights were documented, and my evidence was preserved. Whatever came next, I would face it from a position of strength and preparation. The calm might not last long, but at least I would be ready when the storm hit. The final piece of preparation was perhaps the most important: maintaining my resolve. Despite the pressure, despite the constant surveillance, despite the community division, I knew I was standing up for something fundamental: the right to secure and enjoy my private property. That certainty made all the preparation worth it. The final confrontation began on a foggy Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the gates were installed. I was working in my home office when all my security cameras activated simultaneously. Through the monitors, I watched an unprecedented scene unfold. Barbara Thompson was leading what appeared to be a small army up my driveway. The group included Steve Thompson, Patricia Henderson, several other neighbors I recognized from her faction, and, most concerning, 2 men in suits carrying briefcases. Behind them, a local news van was pulling up to the curb, and a reporter was already setting up a microphone. My security system pinged with multiple alerts as the group approached my gates. Barbara was carrying what looked like a stack of official documents, and her expression suggested she believed she held the winning hand. I immediately activated my phone's recording feature and called my lawyer. "They're here," I said simply, "with lawyers and news crews." "Don't engage without me," my lawyer responded. "I'm 10 minutes away. Record everything." I watched through the security feeds as Barbara positioned herself in front of my gates, clearly playing to the news camera. The reporter was already doing an introduction, gesturing toward my property as she spoke into the microphone. The two men in suits approached my intercom system. One of them pressed the call button. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Jeffrey Webster from the Community Rights Legal Coalition. We're here with concerned residents regarding an urgent property access matter." I pressed the intercom button. "My lawyer is on her way. I'll be happy to discuss any concerns once she arrives." Barbara stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the intercom. "This isn't a request, Alex. We have legal documentation proving this driveway qualifies as a prescriptive easement due to its historical use as a community access point. You'll need to open these gates immediately." The news camera was rolling, capturing every moment. I could see Linda Warren and Rachel Cooper hurrying toward the scene, phones out, documenting everything from different angles. Other neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. My lawyer's car pulled up, just as one of the suited men was taping some kind of legal notice to my gate. She strode purposefully through the gathering crowd, briefcase in hand. "Mrs. Thompson," she called out loudly, ensuring the news camera caught her words. "I presume you have court documentation supporting this prescriptive easement claim." Barbara smiled triumphantly, holding up her stack of papers. "We have sworn affidavits from 38 residents testifying to over 20 years of continuous community use of this driveway. Under state law, that establishes a prescriptive easement." My lawyer's expression didn't change. "Interesting. And do you also have documentation showing this supposed historical use was hostile, open, notorious, and continuous for the statutory period? Because unauthorized use alone doesn't create a prescriptive easement." The suited men exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. "We have extensive documentation of community use patterns." "Use patterns aren't enough," my lawyer interrupted. "You need to prove the previous property owners actively objected to the use and that the community continued using it anyway. Do you have any evidence of that?" The crowd had grown larger. I could see Richard Parker hovering at the edges, looking nervous. The news reporter was soaking it all in, her cameraman capturing every moment of the confrontation. Barbara's confident smile had faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "The community has relied on this access point for decades. You can't just shut it down because one uncooperative resident decides to build gates." My lawyer pulled out her own documentation. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, we have signed statements from the previous 3 property owners explicitly stating they only allowed occasional cut-through traffic as a courtesy, never intended to grant any permanent access rights, and never received any formal easement requests from the HOA or residents." The suited men were now huddled together, examining documents and whispering urgently. The news reporter had moved closer, clearly sensing the story was taking an unexpected turn. "Furthermore," my lawyer continued, "we have documented evidence of repeated harassment, attempted interference with legally permitted property improvements, and organized retaliation against residents who supported Mr. Mitchell's property rights. Would you like to discuss those issues on camera?" Barbara's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is absurd. The community has rights. We've been using this driveway since before he even moved here. Usage by permission isn't the same as a prescriptive easement," my lawyer stated firmly, "and permission can be revoked by any property owner at any time. The gates are legally permitted, properly installed, and fully compliant with all HOA guidelines, as confirmed by your own board's recent ruling." The news reporter had shifted her microphone toward Barbara. "Mrs. Thompson, how do you respond to the suggestion that this is about control rather than legitimate access rights?" Barbara's composure finally cracked. "This is our community," and she shouted, jabbing her finger toward my gates. "We decide how things work here. He can't just come in and change everything because of some technical legal rights. The outburst was caught perfectly on camera. The suited men were already backing away, clearly realizing their prescriptive easement claim wasn't going to hold. Several of Barbara's supporters had also begun to drift away from the scene, not wanting to be associated with her very public meltdown. "Mrs. Thompson," my lawyer said calmly, "I suggest you and your associates leave the property immediately. Any further attempts to interfere with Mr. Mitchell's property rights will result in legal action." The news reporter had found a new angle. "Mrs. Thompson, residents have reported organized retaliation against those who supported Mr. Mitchell's property rights. Would you care to comment on those allegations?" Barbara turned to the camera, seemed to realize how the situation had spun out of her control, and finally fell silent. Steve Thompson appeared at her side, gently trying to guide her away from the scene. "No comment," he muttered, leading his wife back through the crowd. The suited men had already reached their car, pulling away as quickly as dignity would allow. The showdown had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet deflation of Barbara's legal threats and the public exposure of her true motives. The news crew caught it all: the failed prescriptive easement claim, her mask of legal authority slipping to reveal raw entitlement, and her final retreat from my property. As the crowd dispersed, Linda Warren approached with Max. "That's going to make an interesting news story," she said quietly. "Not quite the one Barbara was hoping for, though." Rachel Cooper was already texting me clips she'd recorded of Barbara's outburst. "Documentation," she said with a smile, "just in case we need it later." The gate stood firm, unaffected by the morning's drama. My lawyer stayed for another hour, ensuring all the proper responses were filed to the legal notices they'd tried to serve. The news van eventually pulled away, likely with a very different story than the one Barbara had promised them. The showdown had come and gone, and my property rights had held firm. But as I watched Barbara's white SUV sitting in her driveway across the street, I knew this wasn't truly the end. The balance of power had shifted dramatically in Pine Grove Estates, and Barbara Thompson wasn't someone who would easily accept such a public defeat. The aftermath of the showdown brought changes to Pine Grove Estates that no one could have predicted. The local news segment aired that evening, portraying a story of community overreach and individual property rights. Barbara's outburst became the defining moment, her mask of authority crumbling to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. The morning after the news aired, I found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard Parker, the HOA manager. He was resigning from his position, effective immediately. "Recent events have made it clear that our community needs to reassess its priorities," he wrote. "Sometimes standing up for what's right means stepping away from what's wrong." The ripple effects continued throughout the week. Several of Barbara's strongest supporters began distancing themselves from her cause. The Community Standards Committee she had championed was quietly dissolved by the remaining HOA board members. Patricia Henderson stopped carrying her clipboard on her daily neighborhood patrols. Linda Warren brought the most surprising news during her morning walk. "Barbara's house just got listed for sale," she said, as Max sniffed around my gates. "Steve told me they're looking for a community more aligned with their values." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The gates that had caused so much controversy still stood strong, now a symbol of something larger than just property rights. They represented a community's journey from blind acceptance of authority to understanding the importance of individual rights and proper legal processes. Rachel Cooper was appointed to the HOA board in the wake of the changes. "We're implementing new guidelines," she told me, "clear procedures for handling disputes, proper channels for complaints, and strict rules against organizing retaliation against homeowners." The neighborhood began to heal. The invisible lines that had divided neighbor from neighbor started to fade. The book club resumed its meetings, now held at rotating houses regardless of their owner's stance during the gate controversy. The annual garden tour was replanned, including all willing participants. Joe Martinez, our faithful mailman, noticed the change too. The certified letters have stopped, he mentioned one day, and people are actually talking to each other again instead of just talking about each other. The security cameras that had been so crucial during the conflict still operated, but they captured different scenes now. Neighbors waving as they walked past, children riding their bikes on the proper street, delivery drivers respecting private property boundaries. The atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion had been replaced by one of mutual respect. Barbara's white SUV disappeared from the neighborhood 2 weeks after the showdown. The for sale sign in her yard stood as a testament to the fact that sometimes victory doesn't mean defeating your opponents. It means standing firm until they defeat themselves. The real estate agent selling Barbara's house told a revealing story. Potential buyers keep asking about the gate incident, she confided. They've all seen the news segment online. But you know what? They're impressed by how the community eventually handled it. It shows that this neighborhood can face challenges and grow from them. The lessons learned extended beyond our immediate community. Other HOAs in the area began reviewing their policies, ensuring they struck the right balance between community standards and individual property rights. Our story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing informal arrangements to override legal property rights. Linda Warren summed it up perfectly during one of our conversations. You know, Alex, this was never really about the gates. It was about standing up to bullies who wrap themselves in authority they don't actually have. Sometimes it takes one person willing to say no to change things for everyone. The victory wasn't just in keeping my gates or defending my property rights. It was in helping a community recognize that true neighborhood values aren't about controlling others. They're about respecting boundaries, following proper procedures, and treating each other with dignity. 6 months after the showdown, Pine Grove Estates had transformed. New residents moved in, bringing fresh perspectives and energy. The HOA meetings became forums for genuine discussion rather than platforms for power plays. The community newsletter returned to sharing actual news instead of veiled threats. As I stood in my driveway one evening, watching the sunset cast long shadows through the gate's iron bars, I reflected on how this conflict had changed not just the neighborhood, but everyone involved. We had all learned valuable lessons about standing firm, knowing our rights, and the importance of doing things the right way. The gates still stood, serving their original purpose of securing my private property. But they had become something more, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from standing firm in what's right, even when facing tremendous pressure to give in. New neighbors moved into Barbara's old house, a young family who asked politely about using my driveway as a shortcut. When I explained why I had installed the gates, they nodded understanding. It's good to have clear boundaries, they said, makes for better neighbors. The wisdom gained from this experience continues to guide our community. Property rights are respected, proper procedures are followed, and the balance between community standards and individual rights is carefully maintained. The gates that caused so much controversy have become just another part of the neighborhood landscape. Their story, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. As this chapter of Pine Grove Estates history came to a close, we all emerged wiser, stronger, and more united, not in spite of our differences, but because we learned to respect them. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't in the battles we win, but in the positive changes those battles inspire in ourselves and our community. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.